reality check. We're here to launch the report of the World Bank's April 2022 reality check, forecasting growth in the Middle East and North Africa in times of uncertainty. And it's in partnership with the Middle East Institute. I'm Karen Young, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on Economics and Energy. And it's my pleasure to have the World Bank team with us today who wrote the report and provided the analytics for it, along with Farid Belhaj, the Vice President of the World Bank for the MENA region, and our President of MEI, Paul Salem. I'm going to hand the microphone over to Paul Salem to give a bit of a welcome, and then to Farid, and then we'll go through the report with some presentation by Chief Economist for MENA, Roberta Gatti. Paul, over to you.
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Indeed, it's great to be in another collaboration with the Middle East and North Africa team at the World Bank. This has been certainly an unusual and very unstable number of years, but 2022 is getting even more unpredictable as developments in the region are now joined with developments in and around Ukraine, which has thrown oil markets into disarray and certainly created a lot of tension or uncertainty in the food markets as well, reshuffling both geopolitics and geoeconomics in the months ahead. So there's a lot to dig into, a lot to try to decipher in the very immediate future, which remains very unpredictable. The World Bank is certainly a main player, keeping an eye on the social and economic conditions in the region. So it's great to have Farid, our good friend, Dr. Belhaj, leading the Middle East and North Africa team, and to hear what they have to report in order to better understand the months coming forward. And thank you, Karen, for your leadership on all this on the MEI's side. So welcome, everyone, and over to my dear friend, Dr. Farid Belhaj.
Thank you very much, Paul, and very nice to affix the title of doctor on before my name. I hope that nobody would rely on my doctoral capacities, otherwise we'd be in trouble. No, thank you very, very much. And good morning, good afternoon, Paul, Karen, colleagues, friends, all the participants. Let me welcome all of you. And let me say that it is really great to have this new tradition now to launch our mid-yearly report with you, that using the platform of MEI. It is an important one. And I really hope that we will be able to gel even more this relationship as we move forward. As you mentioned, Paul, the COVID-19 pandemic is entering its third year. The economic impacts continue to reverberate. Global inflation is rising due to supply chain constraints and commodity price shocks. Climate change is still very, very much of a concern, with extreme weather conditions worldwide. And of course, notably in our region, conflict and social unrest persist, and they are creating a sense of deep instability. And now, as Paul mentioned, we have the war on Ukraine that is coupled with sanctions imposed on Russia. And all of these events have huge ramifications. They have ripple effects throughout the world, and notably in our region. Ramifications on global energy, food, capital markets. It's as if we were finding ourselves in the situation of 2008. You remember the three Fs: the global food, fuel, and financial crisis. We are looking at something, more or less like that one. And there are so many lessons to be learned from, that time. 2008, we put on the table a number of issues that need to be learned so that, we are not caught off guard. Well, this time around, unfortunately, we see same, pressures, and we are still not prepared as an international community. In MENA, we have two large chunks in a way. The countries that are negatively impacted by the crisis, and those countries that are, what would say positively impacted by the crisis. The MENA oil exporters are benefiting, obviously, from higher oil prices, and they can better weather the impact of rising food prices or a drop in tourism. At the same time, yet food importers or net food importers in MENA face the burdens of increased food prices and lower tourism inflows. Interestingly enough, last week I was in Jeddah for the Arab Monetary Fund discussion, and one major country raised the flag and said, you in MENA need to stop lumping us in one region. There are very different dynamics between what's happening in the Gulf and what's happening elsewhere. And actually we see it when you look at our growth projection for, as now, they're kind of okay. We're looking at 4 or 5% projection. But at the same time, you need to segregate. If you take away the exporter countries, growth is dismal. And this is part of what Roberta and the team are putting on the table. We need to avoid to be over-optimistic and avoid to be sending these awkward messages that overall things are fine, but overall things are not fine. Because at the end of the day, there will be no winner in this situation. Even those who are having a windfall of money, at the end of the day, living in a dangerous neighborhood would not help them get by. So we need to have that very much in mind as we move forward. Now, this whole report is about uncertainty, and managing uncertainty is a key challenge for policymakers in MENA and elsewhere. So while not all the risks can be mitigated before they materialize, the challenge is to try to focus on those uncertainties that we can kind of try to envisage and try to somewhat predict, and to better navigate these uncertain times. Beyond the provision of emergency program, we need realism, and that realism is at 3 levels. One, realism, and we were caught off guard big time on that, on health system capabilities. Frankly, I for one would have never imagined that in countries like Morocco, Tunisia, Lebanon, Egypt, the COVID-19 will actually totally destroy the health system. We found in Tunisia at some point, Tunisia was the second in the world in the number of deaths caused by COVID-19 per capita. It is immense. And this is, a place that we all thought had a decent health system, and others were in the same situation. So, we need to, and we emphasized it actually last October in our economic update. We need to make sure that, we keep a degree of realism on what our systems are all about, and possibly address those. The second area for realism is about the challenges being posed by debt sustainability. What happened with COVID is that a number of our countries, for very good reasons, went and put a lot of money, financing, to make sure that the most vulnerable would be able to get by. We in the bank financed a number of social safety net projects, but that obviously came with a cost, and the cost is spike in debt. So debt sustainability and the new pressures emerging from the onset of the war in Ukraine, those need to be extremely well thought through, defined, and we need to realize that there is there also a challenge for us to make sure that we see the reality as it is. And third is the realism in preparing policy based on forecasts of growth for 2022 and beyond. And as you will hear during today's presentation, the challenge of growth forecasts in MENA is that they tend to be over-optimistic over the very, very many years. Yesterday, we had a discussion with our good friends from the IMF, and we were discussing that particular issue of being over-optimistic. And that has nothing to do with the quality of our economists. It's basically very much the quality of the data that comes to us, and the way we are interpreting it. So while forecasts of growth, as my good friend Daniel is putting in my notes, just like the weather, are rarely 100% accurate. But as long as they are reasonably estimated, forecasts are helpful. And Daniel is one of our, lighting rods in terms of making sure that forecasts are as accurate as possible. So the risks posed by over-optimism in forecasting can be mitigated, and I guess this report will show in what way they can be. Our goal in the bank is to fully harness our resources to effectively support job creation, sustainable, inclusive growth, risk mitigation, and data transparency in the region. And this is also something, possibly even with your help, Paul and Karen, push our countries, our clients, call them that way, to be more forthcoming when it comes to data. We have data, we have capacity in our countries to extract data from the reality on the ground. The issue is to transfer that data to all of us so that we can help the decision makers in the decision-making processes. And this is the ultimate objective for us. It's to empower policymakers. To empower them, we need to give them as much as we can of our expertise, experience, and that cannot be done efficiently if it is not fed by data that is reliable and that is timely. So it's going to be an interesting discussion today, both in terms of the impact of what's happening around us on our economies, but also at the same time on our own work to make sure that this over-optimism gets tempered a bit by more realistic steps. So thank you so very much to you, Karen, to you, Paul, and to MEI. And now, possibly, I think I'll give the floor back to you, Roberta.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Fareed. Yes, we will go to Roberta's presentation now. And this is the work of the World Bank MENA team and its April 2022 report, if you're just joining us, which is entitled Reality Check. And Fareed just went through 3 reasons of why we should be looking more realistically at the region itself. Roberta, please go ahead.
Thank you, Karen, and thank you, Paul, and Fareed, for laying the groundwork for the discussion of today. Could you just confirm, Karen, that you see one screen?
I can see it, but you are not yet in presentation mode.
So let me go to presentation mode, and hopefully that will work, potentially with a delay.
There you are.
Here we are. Excellent. So as you mentioned, Karen, this report is titled Reality Check, Forecasting Growth in the Middle East and North Africa in Times of Uncertainty. And Fareed has already highlighted the importance of uncertainty as the leitmotif for our work. This is work that we have done at the MENA Chief Economist team in very close collaboration with all the country economists of the region. Without spoiling too much, the messages, let me highlight the emerging key ideas that have come out from our work. First of all, in the macro outlook, uncertainty reigns with the Ukraine war and the pandemic. And we delve a little bit more into what this means. We're seeing an uneven recovery. We'll talk about why, but Fareed has already alluded to a great bifurcation that is happening in our region, with oil exporting countries benefiting from a favorable terms of trade shock, and oil and food importing countries not being hurt by it. Overall, we see a 5.2% growth in GDP per capita for the MENA region. However, we expect that the GDP per capita out of 17 countries will not recover to pre-pandemic levels by the end of 2022. And if we think about GDP per capita, we really think about what is the probably more relevant measure of individuals' well-being. Fareed has already alluded to the fact that in uncertain times, it's really important not to be overconfident. And he spoke about 3 dimensions of overconfidence that could be detrimental to the region. The importance of being realistic about that sustainability, the importance of being realistic about the health system's capability. And when we launched our October semi-annual, we had a great conversation with you, Karen, and your audience on that, but it's also important to be realistic about growth forecast. And this is where the statistical analysis of this report will veer to, and will present some results. These results really bring home a reality check. Forecasts are more uncertain and over-optimistic in the MENA region, and this is independently of who is the forecaster, the World Bank, the IMF, the private sector. And we make the point that timely and credible data systems really improve economic forecast. And we want to conclude with a plea to data transparency and the importance of improving the ecosystem of our countries. Now, let's delve into the global shock and what it means to our region. We've all by now become sadly familiar with what is happening to commodity prices. What you see here on the left are the prices of oil and wheat in the gray, starting from the Ukraine war beginning. You see that they are increasing and they are very variable. However, you can also see that they were increasing already before the war, and we will get back to that. What you see here on the right is what is happening to the US 5-year forward inflation expectations. Why does this matter? Well, you see some increase around the sort of 2%, so still within the bounds that you would expect are relevant for the Fed. However, if inflation expectations become unanchored in the US, we are likely to see a sort of tightening of global monetary conditions, which can have important repercussions for those countries that have high public debt. We'll get back to that a little later. Now, if these are the sort of key elements of the global shocks, how are they playing out in the region? What we did in the report is to try to provide a taxonomy for what are the impacts and the channels on the region, dividing them between direct impacts, which we assume to be things that are happening without a response from government, and knock-on impacts that might reflect a sort of second order or ripple effects. Now, we divided our countries in the 3 typical groups that describe them effectively: MENA oil importers, MENA oil exporters, MENA oil importers, and food importers, which is actually the almost totality of our countries. And what you see here for trade balances, fiscal balances, firm profitability, and household welfare is that overall effects tend to be negative. Increasing prices are a negative shock, with the exception of the trade balances and fiscal balances, and eventually growth also of oil exporters, which now are facing a windfall. However, these first order impacts are likely to be compounded and modified by knock-on impacts that will come later. I already hinted at the possibility of tightening of monetary conditions, and this is something that will be very important for countries that face high debt interest payments, and some of our MENA oil importer countries are exactly in the categories. There is a possibility of heightened social unrest, and we know that the literature associates increasing food prices with protests in the street. There's also the possibility of delays of reversals of reforms that we thought would be essential for a medium to long-term progress in our countries. Finally, because, and here we just talked about the economics of it, but because of the dramatic humanitarian repercussions of the Ukraine war, there's also the possibility that humanitarian assistance gets driven away, diverted away from MENA, which is still coping with ongoing civil war, conflict, and refugees. So here are some of the channels. They include also tourism, receipts, remittances, and so on, through which the global shock can affect our region. But as Farid indicated, the impact will be uneven. And a core divide in how this bifurcation of unevenness will happen is the net importer or exporter positions of our countries. And you see it here in this next slide. You see the in orange, the net fuel exports of countries, and in red, the net food exports of countries. So net food importers will be negatively, and depending on how exposed they are, significantly exposed to the increase in food prices. Net fuel exporters will benefit from the increase in oil prices. Something that I wanted to highlight in this slide is that the countries that, fragile countries such as Yemen and such as Lebanon are particularly exposed to food imports. And this is something that is a particular concern. As I mentioned earlier, this concern doesn't only relate to the Ukraine crisis, the Ukraine crisis onward, but it was also preceding the Ukraine crisis. In this traffic light graph, what you see is the increasing prices of food staples between 2020 and 2022, February 3rd, so before the Ukraine crisis, for all of our countries. And you see quite a bit of red. And when you see red, it's because prices have increased by 20% or more. And the countries that are at most risk are Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Djibouti, and to some extent, less so, Egypt. So this is a concern that we had even before the war. This concern is compounded by the fact that increases in food prices are particularly damaging for the poor and vulnerable. What you see here are data from taken from the 2013 Household Data Survey in Morocco that looks at the share that different deciles of the population. To the left you see the poorest, and to the right you see the richest within Morocco, how much they spend of their consumption in food and energy. And you see that the poor spend up to 61% of their budget in food and energy. So if food and energy prices increase, the impact on the poor is extraordinary. So this is something that is very important to keep in mind, because the unevenness of this impact is not only playing out across countries, but it's also playing out within countries. Now, we spoke about the Ukraine war, but we are not yet out of the woods with the pandemic. I am not an epidemiologist, but if the past 2 years teach us something, they tell us that there is a continuous mutation of the virus, which we don't know what will bring next. But we know one thing is certain here is that vaccination has made a significant difference, not only to decrease mortality and severity of cases, but also to allow our economies to operate in an effective and open way. And what you see here is the vaccination rate as of last week plotted against GDP per capita around the world. And you see in red MENA countries. Thinking about what Farid was saying earlier, you can't lump the MENA region all in one. There's actually a dramatic heterogeneity in our region. You see the GCC, most of the GCC countries well above vaccination rates for income comparators, but you also see a number of middle income countries significantly below where they ought to be. So since we're not out of the wood of the pandemics and we don't know what the future will bring, one way to manage that uncertainty will continue to be to have a robust vaccination campaign, an effective vaccination campaign. Now, let's get to the growth forecasts, which have been so prominent in the spirit and the work that we have done for this report. These are the current growth forecasts that we have for the region. The region is now poised to arrive on aggregate at the level of GDP per capita that it had in 2022. And you see this on the left-hand side graph. However, something that I want to point out is that these averages in the left-hand side do not include Lebanon, Syria, Libya, and Yemen for a variety of either lack of data or uncertainty about the forecast. So there are some of these countries that are unlikely to have robust growth that are not in this average. What you see on the right-hand side is our 3 country groups, and you see how the GCC countries have suffered from significant variability in their growth, which has been driven by both the significant drop in oil prices in 2020 and now the rebound that they see. To try to drive home the point of how the Ukraine crisis is bifurcating the growth prospects for the region, I wanted to show you this one column, which shows the updates of growth forecasts from January to April. So from pre-Ukraine war to post-Ukraine war. And what you see here is that you see that all of the oil importers, one way or the other, are in green, meaning that their growth forecasts have been upgraded, and the middle income oil importers are all in some form of red, with the sole exception of Egypt, which, however, has a very unique way of reporting growth because they work on a fiscal year basis rather than a calendar year basis. So if we were to think about the calendar year 2022 for Egypt, we might be likely to see a higher downgrade than the 0 here. Now, these are the forecasts that our economists have produced in collaboration with country economists in the region. But we promised a reality check, which is a sort of hard look to how growth forecasts are produced and whether, in retrospect, they are realistic, optimistic, and accurate. So let me get to the reality check part of the report very briefly. And the messages here are that growth forecasts in the world, and particularly in MENA, are dramatically over-optimistic. What you see here on the left-hand side panel is that both the IMF and the World Bank tend to overestimate growth in the MENA region. Let me just look at the MENA region, to the tune of 2.9 or 2.5 percentage points. This is for the past 10 years, including 2020. And admittedly, 2020 was a year of a dramatic, unexpected negative shock. However, even when we take out 2020, we see that growth forecasts tend to be over-optimistic. And on the right-hand side, we see a measure of the forecast, the absolute forecast error. So we take the forecast, the growth forecast, we take out the realized growth, and then we just take the absolute value, and we see this as a measure of uncertainty. And so there is quite a lot of uncertainty also around these estimates. What would this mean for us? And this is something that I'm happy to go more in detail in the Q&A if you would like, is that if we were to take the typical adjustment to our growth forecast and adjust it with the median error, so the typical forecast error in the past 10 years, almost all of these growth forecasts would be biased downward. Now, we wanted to be constructive here, and we wanted to see what is likely to determine a larger forecast error. And from our statistical analysis, which builds on a large body of work of statistical analysis by many authors, is that clearly a history of growth volatility, conflict, and commodity shocks is associated with higher forecast error. And this is probably intuitive. However, something that is new in our report is that we show that better data transparency, a better data ecosystem is significantly and systematically connected with more realistic growth forecast. Now, you might think that data transparency is a second order thing to think about now in times of crisis. But if I were just to think back about the pandemic, having the information, for example, of where the virus was flaring up, how it was affecting, was fundamental, not only for the economy, but also to save lives. So there are dimensions of data transparency and data access that are immediate and dramatically important, not only to policy, but to people. Now, what do we know about MENA? There is, again, we cannot lump everyone together in the same pot. there is wide heterogeneity in the statistical performance, but with few exceptions, the Palestinian territories and Egypt, most countries punch below their weight. If we believe that their weight is where they would be supposed to be given their income level. To try to give a sort of like live face to what this means, we took the approach of sort of the mystery client, and we visited all the websites of statistical institute in our region and of Mexico, and benchmarked our region to Mexico. We tried to summarize our work here, and what you see is a lot of red and not too much green. Green is where our countries meet the benchmark of Mexico. Red is where they fall short. And just to give you an example, none of our country publishes monthly unemployment data, which also speaks to a continuous difficulty that we have, us at the World Bank, but also researchers, to try to figure out what is happening to labor markets post-crisis and post-Ukraine crisis. Now, let me conclude here with the core messages that we tried to sort of bring together with this report. The latest growth forecast in MENA is pretty buoyant. It's 5.2%, the fastest rate since 2016. However, we talked about how this growth forecast is very uneven within the region, and how we need to be extraordinarily realistic because uncertainty reigns in the region, not only from the Ukraine war, but also from the continuing pandemic. Over-optimistic forecasts are not only a sort of a statistical curiosum, but they really matter. The evidence shows that when there are over-optimistic growth forecasts, countries end up being over-optimistic about fiscal spending and ending more in debt. What we do here is that we propose a practical, a very low-cost solution, improving transparency, access, and the data ecosystem will really make a difference. So thank you so much for having us for the launch today. Let me also acknowledge all the colleagues that are also connected today who participated to this study, and over to you, Karen.
Thank you, Roberta. That was a fantastic amount of data and information. And for everyone watching or listening, you'll find in the chat, we've got links to the report and the press release in Arabic, French, and English. And you can also pose a question in the Q&A. What we'll do now, I've got a set of questions I'd like to ask Roberta. We'll have a bit of a back and forth, and then we'd like to take questions from the audience. So please, if you have something in mind, go ahead and get that lined up. Roberta, I found it so interesting, and sort of in reading my preview of the report and thinking about the arguments that both Fareed made in terms of, how we should approach with the kind of a dose of realism and in thinking about forecasting in the region, and you were explaining where the shortfalls are. Your point about the existing divergence before this increased pressure on energy markets and food price stability and inflationary pressure because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We saw this coming, within the MENA region, and certainly this divergence always between oil exporters and oil and gas importers, but just sort of different really growth trajectories. And so in this current environment where everyone is, I think, a little bit caught off guard, we're coming out of the pandemic, not really sure what recovery looks like. This is certainly a time of uncertainty. So, this is a theme of the report. What's then, your recommendation? How can the region deal with uncertainty? Are there, very concrete and easy or simple ways to try to approach an environment that is incredibly complex?
Karen, this is an excellent question and a complicated one. What I would like to propose is a humble but really low-cost solution. And I think that investing in good data system, investing in opening this data, and establishing a relationship of trust between those who produce and hold data and those who can use them would be extraordinarily beneficial. And those let me go back to something that Fareed indicated at the beginning. When we talked about overconfident, our report that we had in October, we were looking at how reports about the capabilities of health systems from self-reports were overconfident. And this didn't help. It was associated with shortfalls in the ability of the systems to cope and inability of the authorities to really do their best in the face of a shock that was clearly unprecedented. So realism is not a silver bullet. It will not be a solution to the problem, but it's an excellent way to be able to manage the problem and find solution in the most effective way. Let me just give you an example. You saw this graph where I was showing the share of spending of the poor and the middle class and the better off in terms of food and energy. If you can use that information, if that information is current, is not from 2013, but it is from 2021, let's say, then you can really expand social protection systems in a way that target those who need it the most. And so you help those who need it the most at the least cost for you as a government, which is fundamental now, because as you were saying, we see this high uncertainty and this sort of uneven recovery, particularly in the oil importing countries, and very limited fiscal space. So what you want to do is to have the most effectiveness at the least cost, and data can be fundamental to that.
It is similar from your October projections and sort of the idea of overconfidence and lack of data and sort of understanding of what the reality on the ground is. So I think it's important that in the consistency of the work that you and your economist team do, still finding this issue and having these very broad ramifications. I wanted to ask you though, is there any silver lining? Are there countries or are there sectors in MENA that, besides oil and gas, see some obvious perhaps positive effects from some of the crises and the conflicts that we're seeing, particularly in Europe right now?
Well, let me focus on the most clear windfall, which is the one from oil and prices, and try to reflect on it. I was with Fareed last week in Saudi Arabia, and I had really interesting conversations with the Ministry of Finance about a very unique position in which oil exporters find themselves. They find themselves now in a windfall, handling a windfall that reflects itself in higher growth, better balance of payments, and a boon for fiscal receipts. So how to go about that? And I still would say to go about it prudently. So if we think about the big picture, we still know that the long-term objective is to walk away from fossil fuels, and we know that this is also reflected in prices. If we look at the IEA, it sort of predicts the price of oil to be at $70 per barrel by 2026. So I would treat this windfall as a temporary windfall and try to do good things with it. Some of the good things are the ones that you need to do because the unevenness plays out also within countries. So I would use targeted cash transfers to help the poor, but I would also use this money, particularly for countries that are oil exporters and have a challenge in diversification, to invest in human capital. Human capital has taken a dramatic hit during the pandemics. Think about the losses in learning that are documented the world over for kids who could not be in school. Think about the potential loss in nutrition. I would invest in human capital because this could be the new endowment and the new path towards diversification of these countries. So in that sense, I think that even from the first order boon that comes from this crisis and the favorable terms of trade shocks of for some of our countries, really, really good things can come to it if the money is managed wisely and with investment that look to the future and to diversification.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point, and certainly in the countries that are experiencing an influx of revenue, they do have an opportunity for investing for the future. Absolutely. On the negative side of that, the question that certainly all of us are remembering from the 2008 crisis, which Fareed mentioned, but then also, of course, 2011, which was precipitated by very, very high food prices, and then putting an enormous amount of social stress on MENA societies. So, what is your expectation in terms of rising food prices, and which countries are particularly vulnerable in that respect?
So rising food prices, as I was showing in the sort of in that graph with the red and the green and the yellow and the traffic light, it was a reality even before the war. And we know that both in the literature, in the published literature and in the refereed literature, but also in history, we have examples of increases in food prices being associated with social unrest. What I would say is that these are the reasons why now social protection programs are even more important. What countries want to do, not only the ones that have the windfall, but also specifically the ones that are suffering these adverse terms of trade shock, the net food importers, the ones that see dramatic increase in their food prices, to compensate the poor and the vulnerable. How do you do that? With what people call adaptive social safety nets. And we have good examples in the region. For example, the Tadamon program in Mexico had the largest expansion from pre-pandemic to now. The Takaful and Karama programs in Egypt are primed to do this. How do you do it? You need to have social registries ready. Not only social registries that include the poor now, but social registries that have been forward-looking enough to include the vulnerable. This is what the social protection literature calls building systems. And it's part of a broader concept of preparedness that is very important in our region. And I saw it as someone who has been worked 15 years ago in the region when we saw people in the street, when food prices increased by 40%. Those systems were not there then. But now increasingly in Egypt, in Morocco, in Jordan, countries have built those systems. So my suggestion would be use those systems. That's the most effective and targeted way to compensate and prevent dramatic losses for the poor. Definitely, these are better solutions fiscally than using food subsidies or energy subsidies to compensate, because these are universal and they will end up benefiting also those who don't really need it. So again, even if you're not in a windfall situation, if you are in a situation where you need to make clear trade-offs, it's even more important to think through targeted cash transfers and good social protection to protect the poor and sort of prevent what would be a natural social discontent about a very difficult situation.
Speaking of trade-offs, I mean, perhaps we could talk a little bit about, fiscal decisions in terms of debt management, and what you're describing in terms of targeting vulnerable communities and understanding and being able to forecast, which people are going to be most in need. There's also the problem of being able to kind of forecast how much of your government revenue is going to need to go towards debt repayment. And in the current environment, we expect borrowing to be more expensive. So, what are some of the impending issues, or how do you see debt management sort of rolling out over the next year or so in the MENA region?
So here, this is where realism should reign again. There's no better solution than to grow out of debt management. So out there in the medium to long term, what I hope for our countries is that eventually we will move from a development model that continues to have a large footprint of the state to a model where the state, instead of being the primary actor in the system, becomes the steward of the system. This will have both implications for progressively reducing the government outlays, but also allowing the private sector to be as dynamic as it could be. So nothing is a silver bullet, but growing out of debt is definitely a successful strategy. In the shorter term, what countries need to do is to continue to maintain the confidence that they're managing the debt effectively and increase transparency in the communication around debt. Reducing lack of information about hidden debt is also something that will continue to reassure bondholders. And finally, debt accumulates because of spending. And so again, let me go back to this mantra of spending now is important, social protection now is important, but it needs to be targeted. Use data well to target it and spend this money well in an effective way.
We've got about 15 minutes left, and so I'd like to go to our audience questions now, if that's okay with you, Roberta. We've got some very good ones that are coming in, and one related to this issue of debt. Perhaps we could take that one first, a question about Egypt. And then perhaps we could go back to the point about overconfidence. And is this something that we have seen for quite a long time? How do you explain that in terms of from a policymaking perspective and a governance perspective? Would you like to start with the Egypt case?
On overconfidence?
Well, well, either way, I suppose. We have a question from Doa Adel Manim on a question on Egypt's debt that was one of the first in our queue.
Sorry, let me just read the question. So
sure.
We don't, in the report, let me just have a quick answer to this one. In the report, we don't have debt forecast, but we have measures of fiscal deficit. There's something rather mechanical about how debt grows, and it grows depending on the fiscal deficit, which is the primary deficit and, well, the primary part and the payment on interest. If interests go up, that means that the interest part of the payment will go up. But if the country continues to grow, then we're going to be less in a bind. So Egypt has been a country that had extraordinarily robust growth until last year. Now we're seeing potentially some growth downgrades in the future. It's also a country that had a very thoughtful and very professional management of debt. So although we don't have a forecast, you can kind of back it out from the fiscal deficit that you will see coming up, predicted in our report. But right. You had asked also something about, I was trying to do two things at once.
Yes, sorry, I posed two questions at once.
That's okay, that's okay.
We had a question in the Q&A chat from Rachel Ziemba on the issue, are there countries with particularly who have been consistently overconfident, right? So this question of perhaps a lack of good forecasting or consistently sort of overstretching or thinking that growth forecasts will be better than they turn out to be. Why does that happen? And you know, what are you seeing and what are you trying to describe in that finding?
So this is a very good question. And let me take it also looking back at the sort of health overconfidence. In a way, I see the growth overconfidence and the overconfidence in health systems as part of the same problem. When we were looking at health, almost all of the countries in MENA were overconfident about their ability to respond. And there were two, if I recall correctly, two exceptions. The first one was Jordan, and I think in part Kuwait. But all the countries reported to believe to be more prepared than they wouldn't. And in reality, what we we don't have a statistical model to explain that type of overconfidence. But when we looked at the data and we just identified 9 measures that our expert pointed as fundamental to manage effectively a pandemic, half of our countries did not collect or make public those measures. So although it's not a statistical proof, we found that there was a clear connection between not having data, not making it public, and not having a sort of realistic assessment of the situation. Now, let's move on to growth. Statistically, what we found in growth, in this overconfidence of growth forecast, is the following. First of all, MENA forecast tend to be more optimistic than other regions, independently of whether World Bank, regional forecasters, local forecasters, or the IMF. Even when you take out 2020, this is still the case. There are a variety of reasons. First is because we have a number of conflict economies where the variability is very high. And so when growth variability is high, it's also easy to get it wrong. The second one is systematically correlated with the various indices of statistical performance. And there, what I wanted to highlight is that it's not just like one element of statistical performance, but it's really the data ecosystem that matters, the data production, the frequency of the data access. And I need to be honest, these indices, which are great, and the SPI, the Statistical Performance Index, has been put out by the World Development Report Data for Development, which came out, I think, 6 months ago or so. It's a very sophisticated data index, but it doesn't really get at some important elements of data that might be fundamental for not only the macro, but also the micro policy, which is getting access to micro data. This is not codified, but anyone who has worked on our region knows the challenge of trying to get access to micro data. So in a way, rather than pointing fingers, something that I would like to highlight is that data openness is fundamental. Nothing bad happens if there is this data openness. And sadly, development, at least for somebody like myself who's been like 20 years in development, working on different countries and different regions, is not a linear process. Things are not always going to go up. Things are not always going to go well. They will go well sometimes, and then there's a shock and they don't go well. So showing that things don't go well is a sad and unfortunate part of life. So nothing dramatic is going to happen if these data are out. What is really important is to use data for a learning process, so that as we respond to shock, our economies can be more resilient. They can use the data information and sort of course correct as it is needed. Anyway, that's my plea.
It's a good one. Of course, I think from a government perspective, they would say bad news is, often not good for those sitting in office, right? And that's part of the hesitance. We do have a few more questions on this sort of data issue, if you want to go to those. We had a question from Hakam asking, is everyone working from the same set of less than comprehensive data? Do oil exporting countries have more comprehensive data? And I think in that rubric that you showed with Mexico as a baseline, and I wonder if you'd say why you chose Mexico as sort of a, as kind of standard case comparison point. It was pretty much across the board in lack of reporting, particularly on unemployment issues. Is that right?
That's right. So we chose Mexico because Mexico was a middle-income country that was a large country. It was also a country that had gone through a very dramatic wave of the pandemic. So we didn't want to sort of confuse the fact that during the pandemic, it has been a challenge for national statistical offices and for surveys to go to the field. So we didn't want to shortchange the comparison. We took this simple approach because we wanted to avoid that looking just within the region would give us like a limited view of the potentiality that good and open data can achieve. Mexico is also the country that had started a small program, Progressa, I think about 20 years ago, and had taken the decision back then to impact evaluate it, which is by gold standard, randomize this program and measure the impact of this program to then use that measure to expand the program over the years. And the Progressa programs, which then became Oportunidades, changed names, changed a bit of nature, has been one of the most fundamental changes that happened in social policy in the past 2 decades. So this was a country that had used data effectively, that was income-wise comparable to our countries, and that publishes data, has data at high frequency available. So on the macro side, they have data available. On the micro side, they also allow researchers and policymakers to have access to data. And it is through that work also outside of the government that the quality of data improves, and that also the government can rely on a collective brain, which goes way beyond what it pays for. So the government can rely on good analysis for free. So in a way, something that I wanted to highlight again is that everything these days comes at the cost, and fiscal space is very limited. But investing in data to help course correct, to help optimize policies, to help target them, it's a low-cost policy that has tremendous returns.
And I love that you emphasize the ability to get work for free. That's what we do in the think tank community, right? We take the publicly available information and then try to make recommendations and arguments from it. So you're exactly right. There's a whole kind of ecosystem that is able to, take government information and government statistics and then, sometimes make arguments that a government may not agree with, but at least everyone can agree that there is kind of a baseline set of information. So I think that's an incredibly important point. A follow-up to that, we had a question from Mark. I mean, you're talking about overconfidence and sort of the upward bias in some of this lack of information, but do we also have the reverse problem in terms of a downward bias? Sometimes it seems like you're just as likely to make a mistake in the opposite direction if you don't have good information.
So good point. And I wanted to say 2 things. The first one, it was related to the previous question. And as an economist, I should believe that there's no free lunch. But the use of data, I think, across the community of policymakers, policy thinkers, think tanks, academic is probably as close to a free lunch that the government can get as it gets in economics. Second, this is a very good question that Mark asks about, it should be, equally likely to be a downward bias. No, this is not the case. So this is a systematic error. So it's a systematic over-optimism that we see over the past 10 years. This is not only us haven't seen it, there are research papers that have shown it. So of course, there are some countries where forecasts have been slightly over pessimistic, but on average and systematically, we see over optimism. So this is an over optimism bias, which we have not fully unpacked. Something that I didn't mention is that 50% of the variation in our regression still remained unexplained. So we don't know why, but we know that it is systematic. And it doesn't necessarily help to be a local predictor. And you can imagine that different forecasters might have different incentives. You might want to please the government, or you might want to not please the government. So there might be other incentives that go beyond the statistical evidence. We are unable to explain them, but what I can say is that we see a systematic over-optimistic bias. This is not classical error of, sometimes it goes up, sometimes it goes down.
Fascinating. Well, we have reached the end of our hour together. Again, I'm just incredibly grateful to the MENA team at the World Bank for their work, for Roberta for presenting it so succinctly, even though she's probably not feeling well, but you did a beautiful job. To Farid Belhaj for his introductory comments, and for Paul Salem for supporting our collaboration with you. And you're welcome back anytime. Thank you so much for choosing us to help launch this report. Again, for everyone listening and watching, it's available online in French and Arabic and English. Thank you so much. Paul, any goodbyes?
No, just thanks to everybody, and a very, very useful session. Thanks for everybody. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Roberta. Thank you, Farid.
Thank you, Paul, Farid, Karen. And let me spend this one last 30 seconds to thank the team that worked with me on this. And these are Daniel Lederman, Asif Islam, Christina Wood, Rachel Fan, Han Nguyen, Rana Lofty, and Menna Musa. It is thanks to them that all of this has come together. And also thank you to the country economists of each of our countries. It's been a pleasure to work with all of you. Thank you, Karen.